Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Dark and Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
In this podcast, we flex our creative muscles and mainly your patience by narrating original stories complete with totally professional sound effects. This will be the best 30 minutes of your life you'll never get back. Today's episode is called Blackwater Part 2. In this second installment of the Blackwater trilogy, an innocent woman makes a breathtaking discovery in the Amazon jungle that could change her life and possibly impact the world. But instead, she becomes an unwilling participant in a deranged man's mission of revenge. Tanya Barrett tried to ignore the feeling of something slithering against her ankle, but couldn't resist and looked down to see a small snake make its way leisurely from her leg into the bush, then took a breath and put her eye back to the scope of her camera. She pulled the fringes of her camouflage netting closer, and her body grew still again as she watched a patch of shoreline across a small river. She'd been sitting in the same position for hours, nestled into a small berm on the shore of a tributary in the Amazon jungle. A friend of hers who had been in the military's special forces had taught her how to make something called a ghillie suit, which was a swatch of netting interlaced with branches, leaves, and grass. Like her friend, she often draped the suit over herself while on location. Unlike her friend, however, the only thing she was aiming was a powerful digital camera. It had all started with a camping trip to the Washington state area, where Tanya had first seen a Sasquatch. She'd been alone at the time and without a camera, so of course everyone she told looked at her skeptically and just did the smile and nod thing. Regardless, she was fascinated by the Sasquatch and other fantastic creatures described in mythology, lore, and most of all, personal encounters. Therefore, she watched every documentary, read every book, and spoke with whoever would share information about the elusive cryptids. She interviewed prominent researchers and con men, taking lessons from each with equal enthusiasm. Tanya quickly realized an uncanny talent for finding these mythological creatures when she intuited where Bigfoot made its camp in the Pacific Northwest. After only a couple days in the woods, she'd been seized by an inexplicable urge to sit on the side of a hill, camouflage herself, and watch a certain stand of trees below. Within a couple of hours, she had filmed a large, hairy primate moving through the brush. It was the most detailed footage ever captured of the elusive creature and catapulted her into instant fame among cryptozoologists and citizens throughout the world. She followed this success by capturing irrefutable video proof of a couple of yetis in the Andes, a wendigo in British Columbia, a chupacabra in Arizona, and various other creatures that had eluded attention and belief for years. As her reputation grew, she was approached by various private research firms who paid her serious money to find and document various cryptids. So it seemed like a no-brainer when she was approached by a large multinational biochemical company and offered an enormous sum to track down a little-known amphibious humanoid they referred to simply as Specimen Alpha, which inhabited the uncharted rivers and tributaries of South America. When she had arrived at the staging area, she was shocked to see a rather large, fortified camp that was far too organized and involved way more guns to be anything other than a military outpost. Her liaison at the post, Manuel, was short, lean, and intense. Although he was probably her age, Manuel's eyes were of a man much older. He told her she was to observe and report any sightings so they could send a research team to collect samples. Tanya could hear all the air quotes in that sentence and felt uneasy about taking the job. However, the amount of money she'd been given up front was more than she'd made in the past couple of years, and she was promised the same amount if she was able to provide adequate proof of the specimen alpha's existence. So she'd swallowed her reservations and followed instructions. They'd outfitted her with the most advanced gear available and dropped her off on a random beach. She walked for a while, following the shoreline, until she found a good place to settle in, and where she was now sharing ground space with snakes and other indigenous critters, waiting for a glimpse of some kind of fishman. Her back began to cramp, and she shifted uncomfortably, telling herself she'd give it another 5 minutes before moving to another location, when a small splash caught her attention, and she froze, staring ahead at the water where the sound had come from. She blinked rapidly in disbelief as a gray fin sliced the surface of the water, then turned toward her side of the river. Suddenly he was there, a fishman walking out of the water onto the shore about 25 feet away. Tanya remembered her camera and pressed the button to begin recording. The creature was 5 or 6 feet tall and lanky, its skin a mottled gray and green, with swatches of webbing between long fingers and toes on disproportionately wide hands and feet. From where she was, she could hear it breathing heavily, as if it had been running. She gasped softly at its face, which reminded her of a piranha. Giant eyes, ringed with gold, dominated the face, which included small round nostrils perched over a wide mouth that hung slightly open, revealing rows of small but sharp teeth. Another small fin bisected the head from front to back, and there were large slits where its ribs would be. She assumed these were gills. Tanya froze as it began walking towards her. Her heart pounded.
Boom, 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 boom.
As she realized its path would take it very near her position. She turned her head slightly and then pressed herself down, willing herself to be as still as possible. A moment later, she heard the rustle nearby.
Who's Russell?
And glimpsed the gray form as it weaved through the trees. She held her breath as it paused and raised its head, sniffing the air. Then it moved on, and a second later she heard another rustle on her left. She turned her head slowly and was amazed to see Manuel, covered head to toe in black and green face paint and wearing jungle fatigues, slowly crouch-walking as he kept pace with the creature. He was aiming a short rifle at the creature's receding form as it walked further into the forest. She watched Manuel make a complicated hand gesture and point at the creature. Then he stopped and dropped to one knee, snapping his rifle up to eye level, aiming through the scope. She gave a startled yelp as a loud boom echoed through the trees.
Boom!
Suddenly, Manuel was up and running, and she could hear the sharp staccato of an automatic rifle somewhere nearby, followed by an inhuman wail that hurt her ears and heart. She jumped up and staggered after Manuel, cursing the pins and needles in her legs.
Mother Puss Bucket.
Finally, she saw him stopped ahead, flanked by a couple other men in the same attire. As she drew closer, she could see the lean gray figure lying on the ground, partially dismembered and pocked with holes. Black ichor was splattered around it, evidence that it hadn't died painlessly. Suddenly, she was furious. She shoved Manuel from behind, and he pitched forward with unexpected force, face-planting into the ground next to the creature's torn body. He immediately sprang to his feet and pointed his rifle at Tanya, face contorted in surprise and anger. Normally this would have intimidated her into silence, but she was too enraged to care. "You used me as bait. You had no intention of capturing or studying this creature. This was an assassination," she screamed at him, disregarding the unwavering muzzle pointed at her head. Manuel glanced at the other two soldiers, and his expression smoothed into a stoic mask. "You didn't have a need to know. Get your stuff, and let's move out." He started to walk past her, but she grabbed his arm, further incensed by his dismissive attitude. "You can't," she began, but then he slugged her on the side of the head. and she dropped to the ground, stunned. She vaguely felt hands under her armpits haul her roughly to a standing position. Then there was an arm around her waist as her knees began to buckle again, so they half dragged her away from the creature and further into the trees as she slipped in and out of consciousness. Finally, they came to the bank of another small river where one of those inflatable boats was waiting. She started to get her senses back and shrugged off the soldier's arm, only to stagger forward and fall again to her hands and knees. "Put her in the boat," Manuel said. The hands were back, picking her up easily and hurling her into the boat.
Blech.
She hit her head on something hard and struggled to sit up, but the boat was already moving away from the shoreline, with each of the men digging at the water with the small paddles. After a minute, the outboard sputtered to life, and Manuel pointed them downriver. Tanya was furious and scared, but her head hurt too much to do anything about it, so she just hugged her knees, folded her arms over her head, and stayed like that. A while later, she felt another jolt as the boat slid onto the shore again. The men tugged her upright and forced her to climb over the side, then surrounded her and walked with her toward a small clearing where several tents were set up. She watched Manuel stride quickly ahead to a tent where another man had emerged. Tanya's hackles went up at the sight of the figure. He wasn't particularly big, but his presence radiated danger in a way that Manuel's didn't. This man wore a balaclava and sunglasses, and every inch of skin was covered up. He'd obviously been injured somehow, since his left arm hung limply by his side, and as he started to walk towards her, she could see he walked with a pronounced limp. Manuel trailed behind him like a faithful dog, then announced him in a tone bordering on reverence. "This is the captain." Tanya took an involuntary step backwards as the other man drew near, every primal instinct urging her to turn and run, but she forced herself to stand her ground and met his gaze behind the mirrored sunglasses. The captain whispered something to himself, too low for her to hear, and then reached up, took off his sunglasses, and pulled off his balaclava. Tanya gasped and shrank back again despite herself. The left side of his face was a mass of bright red scar tissue, and there was a dark pit where his left eye had been. He pulled off his gloves to reveal more burn scars on his hands, which he held up at eye level, showing her both sides as if he were getting ready to perform a magic trick. Tanya shrank back even further as he pulled at the bottom of his black shirt, raising it to reveal a map of crisscrossing welts, ridges, and more burn scars. For a moment, Tanya thought he might intend to simply undress right there in front of her, but he stopped, pulling his shirt down. He leaned forward, and Tanya was transfixed by his one good eye, which glittered with madness. "You obviously don't understand your role here, Miss Barrett," he said. "The thing we're dealing with did this to me." He waved a scarred hand vaguely at himself, but then tightened it to a single pointing finger which he had directed at her face. "Your job is to find Specimen Alpha and notify me when you do. I know you can find it. That's your gift, right? So all you have to do is find," he swallowed and grimaced slightly in distaste, "Alpha, and we'll take care of the rest. Everybody wins." He leaned in again, and Tanya edged further away, but she bumped into the soldier standing behind her.
Oof.
"But if you try to do something stupid and try to save it or warn it, or even if you see it and you just don't tell me, nobody will ever find your body. Do you understand?" Tanya stammered in confusion. But they already killed it, didn't they? They were waiting for it. It's dead." The man smirked, which distorted his already ravaged features into a more horrifying mask. "No, That was the baby. We were able to track that one easily enough ourselves. The Alpha is a lot smarter, so we need to find someone like you to help us find it. Well, how will you know which one is the Alpha? She asked. Again, the terrible smirk surfaced briefly. Oh, you'll know it when you see it. Manuel and the other men laughed. Get some sleep. We have a long day tomorrow. The captain slid his hands back into the gloves and turned to leave, but then looked at her with that malevolent blue eye. Remember, Miss Barrett, you're here for one thing only. Find the Alpha for us. If you can't or won't do that, then we really had no use for you. With that, he returned to his tent with Manuel walking quickly to keep up and whispering to him.
Hey, where are we going for dinner?
A nudge propelled her toward a small tent at the edge of the clearing. When she ducked into it, she was surprised to see her gear piled on the ground next to a tiny cot.
Surprise!
Suddenly, the fear and the horror of the situation overwhelmed her, and she stumbled over to the cot, blinded by hot tears of despair. She wept uncontrollably for a long time, until exhaustion claimed her and she slept. Soon after, however, she was startled awake when a gruff voice outside her tent said, "Wake up, Barrett." She poked her head out to see the men scurrying around excitedly, despite the early morning hour. They were collecting their own gear and weapons in the dim light of a couple lanterns. Manuel materialized out of the darkness next to her, startling her.
Ah!
"Get your gear and let's go," he said. "Where? What's going on?" she asked. "Another team found it. We're en route to intercept." She collected her camera case and ghillie suit, and then followed Manuel to the shore, where a second inflatable boat sat next to the one she'd come in on. The first was full, with the captain sitting in the front. She had to squeeze in next to a couple of men on the second boat, which was severely uncomfortable, but she was still grateful she didn't have to be in the first boat with the captain. The two boats made no attempt at stealth, engines buzzing at full speed up the river for several minutes, until Tanya could see a large white shape materialize in the gloom. It was a riverboat, probably 45 feet long. The smaller boats zoomed right up to the larger boat,
Zoom.
turning sharply at the last minute to slide up to the side in an obviously practiced maneuver, and a couple of soldiers leaped on board, securing the Zodiac boats to cleats at the stern. The rest of the soldiers clambered aboard, and one of them held out a hand to help Tanya. No sooner had she stepped on deck than it lurched forward, the outboard motors roaring. The men busied themselves preparing all sorts of sinister-looking gear, such as long spears and nets and brutal-looking machetes. They even set up a large machine gun on a pole mounted on the bow. She situated herself in a corner, trying to make herself look as small as possible. But each time she saw the captain looking in her direction, she felt a tremor of fear work its way through her. Now that they were chasing the Alpha, what would happen to her? But she tried not to think about that, choosing instead to focus her thoughts inward, so she could calm herself and try to find a way out of the situation. About 20 minutes later, the boat slowed suddenly and the men shifted in anticipation. The captain rushed to the wheelhouse at the rear of the boat to converse in low, hushed tones with the man driving it.
Hey, what are you doing later?
Presumably a local by the way he was dressed in simple cotton clothes instead of black body armor. She wondered idly if they called that guy Captain also. The man held out a small radio to the captain, who held it up to his ear. She could faintly hear the babbling of a voice at the other end, but couldn't make out what it was saying. The captain nodded, spoke a few words into the radio,
Bagel, psst, taco,
and handed it back to the driver. The soldiers gathered around him as he strode to the middle of the deck. They all huddled together for a couple of minutes, and Tanya's heart lurched as Manuel and a couple of other men turned and glanced her way. The boat had slowed almost to walking speed, the engines running only fast enough to keep it in one place against the current of the river. Then there were loud splashes.
Sploosh.
As they threw a couple of anchors overboard, and the engine stopped a minute later. The sudden silence was deafening. Tanya strained to hear a sound other than the lapping of the waves at the boat's hull.
Alum.
But she could hear nothing. No insects or animal noises or bird calls, nothing. The men turned off all the lights, throwing the boat into almost complete darkness. After a moment, Tanya could begin to make out vague outlines of the men against the lighter color of the boat decks and walls. One of the men passed near enough that she could see an odd bulge on his head, and then it took a moment for her to realize they were all wearing night vision goggles. Mentally slapping her head,
Ow!
she quickly dug out her camera case, navigating by feel, and pulled the expensive device out. She turned it on and switched it to infrared mode, and then dug out a powerful infrared spotlight, affixing it to the top of the camera. To anyone else looking at her in the dark, the IR lights would look just like a dim red light. But looking through the viewpiece, the deck of the boat was illuminated bright as day. By habit, she pressed the record button and began scanning around the boat, capturing all the men as they moved to different areas, each growing still as they settled into a crouched or a prone position, peering out into the surrounding jungle. Tanya watched the captain curiously. Unlike the rest of his men, he stood fully upright in the middle of the deck with his back to her, balancing himself against the gentle sway of the boat, his head panning from side to side. Suddenly, there was a thump and a loud scream from the rear of the boat, followed by a splash.
Sploosh.
The men dashed toward the sound, and Tanya peered around the corner with her camera. She remembered the boat's driver had been standing back there, but now there was only a large dark stain on the deck near the railing, which she quickly realized was blood. Pausing to glance at it for only a moment, the captain quickly regrouped, stalked to the knot of men, speaking in low, harsh tones, and they quickly disbanded, running back to their original positions. Tanya could taste bile coming up in her throat, and a scream was trying to push its way out. She knew if she started screaming, she'd never stop. So she did the only thing she could think of. She pulled her ghillie suit over herself. She knew everyone could see her, but reverting to the classic childhood defense against the nighttime boogeyman was nonetheless effective. After a moment, her chest stopped hitching, and her breathing was back to normal. She was tired, and her body hurt from getting pushed and shoved and dropped by these assholes all day. So she leaned her head back against the wall of the wheelhouse, and despite herself, she must have dozed for a minute, because then she was jolted awake by a gunshot.
Pew, pew, pew.
Tanya pulled the ghillie suit down in time to see the captain sprint over to one of the men, who was shouting and pointing at something off to the right.
It's the ghost light.
Without hesitating, the captain raised his rifle and fired a long burst into the water and shoreline.
Pew, pew, pew.
A third man ran over to the mounted machine gun and swiveled it to point at the same area, and Tanya clapped her hands over her ears as the thunderous roar of the machine gun filled the night.
Brr, brr, brr.
The rest of the soldiers joined in, their bullets kicking up geysers of water and dirt, but little else. After what felt like an eternity, the men stopped firing. Tanya's ears were ringing,
Ding, ding, ding.
and she could barely hear the clicks and ratcheting sounds of the men reloading as gun smoke wafted across the deck. A small movement to the left of her peripheral vision caught her attention, and she turned to glimpse a ripple in the water on that side of the boat. For a moment, it looked like the fin of the other fishman she'd seen earlier cutting through the water. She kept her eyes glued to that spot for a minute, then gasped as first one and then a second enormous webbed hand tipped with jagged black claws grasped the side of the boat. Time seemed to slow down, and she sat frozen, eyes wide in terror, staring through the camera as the creature's claws gouged furrows in the wooden deck, and it pulled itself silently out of the water and over the railing. Now she could see why the captain had been amused at her question before. This was obviously the Alpha. It had to be 7 or 8 feet tall and pale, like the underbelly of a fish, where the first creature had been built like a swimmer with lithe muscles and lean frame. This looked more like a pro wrestler with impossibly wide shoulders and long, heavily muscled arms, and the boat shifted slightly as its weight hit the deck. Huge, unblinking, gold-rimmed black eyes were set in a scarred face dominated by a gaping maw, lined with small, serrated teeth like those of a shark. It was the stuff of nightmares, and it was looking at her. A primal instinct for survival flared in the face of this apex predator, and Tanya dropped her camera, leaped to her feet, and turned to run, only to tangle her feet in the ghillie suit and crash to the deck. Even without the camera, she could see the looming figure of the creature silhouetted against the lighter blackness of the jungle. And it was getting closer and closer, and this time she didn't even bother to hold back the scream.
But what happens next?
So there is more. There is a part 3.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, that's why we split it up into 2 more episodes.
2 more episodes?
Well, this one and the next one. We have part 3 coming up.
Oh.
As if you didn't know.
Okay, I knew. So, to be continued.
To be continued, yes. Join us next time for the thrilling conclusion of Blackwater, Part 3.
Am I supposed to say something?
Uh,
That's not an answer.
I mean, whatever. So if you got this far, you'll probably want to finish the journey with us next time as we conclude. Or, yeah.
I think conclude is the right word.
Yeah, that is the right word. So there is a part 3, and you can join us next time for the thrilling conclusion of Blackwater. We hope you enjoyed listening to our story as much as we enjoyed telling it. We're pretty sure you have more friends than we do, so be sure to tell them all about us and click to follow our podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram at dark.n.precious or follow us on Facebook at Dark&Precious Storytime. Feel free to leave us any feedback or if you have any story suggestions. Who knows? You might just hear your story idea come to life in the next episode of Dark&Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.